Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented in the 15th week of 2014 by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Our subject is terrorism and what can be done to combat it. It's hard for us Americans to admit that by far the greatest terrorist campaign in the world today is being run by the Obama administration, not by those we usually call terrorists. U.S. terrorism is not just Obama's drone strikes, which have killed 5,000 people, including 200 children. It's also the activities of the U.S. Special Operations Command, essentially the president's private army of some 70,000 people, who are active, according to their own spokesman, in more than 130 countries around the world. Their activities include kidnapping, which we call rendition, torture, and murder. It's part of the U.S. policies pursued by this and earlier administrations that have plagued the world with war and destruction. Not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of the tiny American economic elite, the 1%, who have gotten 95% of the income gains in the Obama years. Most Americans don't realize that Obama is carrying out the most extreme global campaign of terror in living memory, in part because the media downplay it and accept the Obama administration's flat lies that the war is winding down. I'm Carl Estabrook. We'll talk about that tonight with help from commentaries from Ron Zoke, Armed and Dangerous, Karen Aram, Hegel in Asia, Deborah Johnson, Independence or Partisanship, Stuart Levy, with whatever's on Stuart's mind, and it'll be worthwhile, and a video of Obama's war coming home, the police killing of a homeless man in New Mexico that led to several nights of rioting by a militarized police force in Albuquerque. For a dozen years, Aware has conducted monthly anti-war demonstrations in Champaign-Urbana. We held another one last Saturday in downtown Champaign. We distributed a flyer entitled "Obama Dresses Up Aggression as Idealism," which describes how the lie that Russia sent an army into Ukraine and annexed Crimea is now accepted as fact everywhere in the West. Obama, whose government overthrew the democratically elected government in Ukraine and appointed a stooge government that has threatened the Russian provinces of Ukraine, falsely accuses Putin of invading and annexing Crimea. Obama, or his handlers and programmers, are relying on the total historical ignorance of Western peoples. The war party in the U.S., including both Republicans and Democrats, have used to fashion news that is simply false. Obama recently declared that Washington's destruction of Iraq, up to 1 million people killed, 4 million displaced, infrastructure in ruins, sectarian violence exploding, a country in total ruins, is nowhere near as bad as Russia's acceptance of Crimea's vote for independence, which occurred without Russia firing a shot. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry actually ordered Putin to prevent the referendum and stop Crimeans from exercising self-determination. Obama's speech on March 26 to the European Union in Brussels is surreal. It is beyond hypocrisy. Obama says that Western ideals are challenged by self-determination in Crimea. Obama says must be punished by the West for permitting Crimeans to exercise self-determination. The return of a Russian province by its own volition to its mother country, where it existed for 200 years, is presented by Obama as a dictatorial, anti-democratic act of tyranny. Here was Obama, whose government has just overthrown the elected democratic government of Ukraine and substituted stooges chosen by Washington in the place of the elected government, speaking of the hallowed ideal that, quote, people in nations can make their own decisions about their future, close quote. That is exactly what Crimea did, and that is exactly what the U.S. coup in Kiev contravened. In Obama's bizarro world, self-determination consists of governments imposed by Washington. Here was Obama, who has shredded the U.S. Constitution, speaking of individual rights and the rule of law. Where is this rule of law? It is certainly not in Kiev, where an elected government was overthrown with force. It is certainly not in the United States, where the executive branch has spent the entirety of the new 21st century establishing government above the law. Habeas corpus, due process, the right to open trials and determination of guilt by independent jurors prior to imprisonment and execution, and the right to privacy have all been overturned by the Bush-Obama regimes. Torture is against U.S. and international law. Yet Washington set up torture prisons all over the globe and apparently still conducts them. How is it possible that the representative of the war criminal U.S. government can stand before a European audience and speak of rule of law, individual rights, human dignity, self-determination, freedom, without the audience breaking out in laughter? Washington is the government that invaded and destroyed Afghanistan and Iraq on the basis of lies. Washington is the government that financed and organized the overthrow of the Libyan and Honduran governments, and is currently attempting to do the same in Syria and Venezuela. Washington is the government that attacks with drones and bombs populations in the sovereign countries of Pakistan and Yemen. Washington is the government that has troops all over Africa. Washington is the government that has surrounded Russia, China, and Iran with military bases. It is this warmongering collection of Washington war criminals that now asserts that it is standing up for international ideals against Russia. No one applauded Obama's nonsensical speech in Brussels. But for Europe to accept such blatant lies from a liar without protest empowers the momentum towards war that Washington is pushing. Obama demands more NATO troops to be stationed in Eastern Europe to, quote, contain Russia. Obama said that a buildup of military forces on Russia's borders would reassure Poland and the Baltic states that as NATO members, they will be protected from Russian aggression. This nonsense is voiced by Obama despite the fact that no one expects Russia to invade Poland or the Baltic countries. Obama doesn't say what effect the U.S.-NATO military buildup and numerous war gains on Russia's borders will have on Russia. Will the Russian government conclude that Russia is about to be attacked and strike first? This reckless carelessness of Obama is the way wars start. Declaring that, quote, freedom isn't free, close quote, Obama is putting pressure on Western Europe to pony up more money for a military buildup to confront Russia. The position of the government in Washington and its puppet states, Eastern and Western Europe, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Georgia, Japan, and other allies purchased with bags full of money, is that Washington's violation of international law by torturing people, by invading sovereign countries on totally false pretenses, by routinely overthrowing democratically elected governments that do not toe the Washington line, is nothing but, quote, the indispensable and exceptional country bringing freedom and democracy to the world, close quote. That's in fact the way they talk in Washington. But Russia's acceptance of the self-determination of Crimean people to return to their home country is, quote, a violation of international law. Just what international law has Washington and its puppets not violated? Obama, whose government in the past few years has bullied Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Lebanon, Iran, Honduras, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela, is now trying to bully Russia, and they actually declared that, quote, bigger nations cannot simply bully smaller nations, close quote. You can't make this stuff up. That's the American Secretary of State. What does Obama and his speechwriters think Washington has been doing for the entirety of the 21st century? Who can possibly believe that Obama, whose government is responsible for the deaths of people every day, even now, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, and Syria, cares a whit about democracy in Ukraine? Obama overthrew the Ukrainian government in order to be able to stuff the country into NATO, throw Russia out of its Black Sea naval base, and put U.S. missile bases in Ukraine on Russia's border. The Obama administration is angry that their plan didn't pan out as intended, and they're taking that anger and frustration out on Russia. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it's put into practice by President Obama. And we'll begin tonight with Ron Zoke, armed and dangerous. Yes, they are.
Well, I want to comment on two recent articles about the American military might, the buildup of the most advanced technology in the world. Our military and our leaders seem absolutely fascinated with hyper-advanced technology, and much of it has not been proved to work yet, but hey, it's sophisticated, it's gleaming, and we want to try it out and see if it works. So eventually it will occur to someone, why do we have all of this super expensive, highly sophisticated technology, and if we're not going to use it? And others will say, saner moments, I hope, that, well, the point of having it is, of having obvious military superiority over others, is that we will never have to use it. But the argument goes back and forth, and so this has been going on for a long time. More and more super advanced military technology, high-powered weapons are being announced, and they are becoming more and more and more expensive, and a lot of people just don't see the point. Case in point here. U.S. sending 2 warships to Japan to counter North Korea. What? Wow. Are we in any real danger from North Korea? I can't imagine that. But anyway, U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel delivered a 2-pronged warning to Asia-Pacific nations Sunday. Asia-Pacific nations. Who do you think that means?
Yeah.
That the U.S. will send 2 additional ballistic missile destroyers to Japan to counter the North Korean threat. There it is again. What threat? But anyway, in unusually forceful remarks about China, Hagel drew a direct line between Russia's takeover of Ukraine's Crimea region and the ongoing territorial disputes between China, Japan, and others over remote islands in the East China Sea. Again, this is staggering. What are you talking about? A direct line between the Crimean situation and the remote islands in the East China Sea. 3 or 4 little islands there that are uninhabited, and how can he make any connection, whatever? I don't know. The further statement is we must be very careful, and we must be very clear, all nations of the world, that in the 21st century this will not stand. You cannot go around the world and redefine boundaries and violate territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations by force, coercion, and intimidation, whether it's in small islands in the Pacific or large nations in Europe. Well, wonderful, Mr. Hagel, but he didn't talk about Israel, which is doing exactly that, without a peep from the USA. So another article on Russian television repeating the same basic information. The U.S. will send 2 more missile defense system destroyers to Japan, the new Aegis destroyers that specialize in shooting down ballistic missiles. So next point, U.S. Navy to test futuristic super-fast gun at sea in 2016. This is the new electromagnetic railgun, which can fire, this says, a low-cost 23-pound projectile at 7 times the speed of sound. So at Mach 7, anything, even a pellet, has enormous kinetic energy and will pierce just about anything. So this Rear Admiral Clunder, the Chief of Naval Research, told a recent meeting that this would be mounted on a ship called the USNS Millinocket, a high-speed vessel for sea trials beginning in 2016. Quoting, "It's now reality and it's not science fiction. It's actually real. You can look at it. It's firing," said Clunder, who planned to discuss progress on the system later with military and industrial leaders at a major maritime event, the Sea Air Space Exposition near Washington.
No one's supposed to knock it, right?
Right. It will help us in air defense. It will help us in cruise missile defense. It will help us in ballistic missile defense, he said.
Amazing.
We're also talking about a gun that's going to shoot a projectile that's about 1/100th the cost of an existing missile system today. This is hard to read because it sounds a lot like it was written by Dr. Seuss, but anyway. That, he says, this new weapon will give our adversaries a huge moment of pause to go, do I ever, also Valley Girl, do I even want to go engage in a naval ship? Klundert told reporters. You could throw anything at us, frankly, and the fact that we can now shoot a number of these rounds at a very affordable cost, it's my opinion that they don't win. So, wonderful.
For sure,
Admiral,
for sure.
Yeah, Klundert. Okay, slightly different topic then. This was posted, I think, by Karen or one of you here. The less Americans know about Ukraine's location, the more they want the U.S. to intervene.
Right.
So, in March 28th to 31st, the Pew Research asked a national sample of over 2,000 Americans what action they wanted the U.S. to take Ukraine, but with a twist. In addition to measuring standard demographic characteristics and general foreign policy attitudes, we asked our survey respondents to locate Ukraine on a map, and a remarkable relationship emerged. The less they knew about where Ukraine was, the more favorable they were toward U.S. Military intervention. It's devastating. So they supposedly identified Ukraine by clicking on a high-resolution world map, and some of them put it in Africa, some in South America, and all over the place. Accuracy varies across demographic groups. In general, younger Americans tended to provide more accurate responses than their older counterparts. Let's see. 27% of 18 to 24-year-olds correctly identified Ukraine, compared with 14% of 65-plus-year-olds. Men tended to do better than women, with 20% of men correctly identifying Ukraine and 13% of women. Members of military households were no more likely to correctly locate Ukraine than members of non-military households. But self-identified independents, 29%, outperformed both Democrats, 14%, and Republicans, 15%. Unsurprisingly, college graduates, 21%, were more likely to know where Ukraine was than non-college graduates, as you would hope. But anyway, even 77% of college graduates failed to correctly place Ukraine on a map. The proportion of college grads who could identify Ukraine is slightly higher than the proportion of Americans who told Pew that President Obama was a Muslim in August 2010. So they go on to ask, does it really matter if they know where it is or what they're talking about? And you can speculate on that, but I'll stop.
Can I comment
Thank you,
on
Ron.
that?
Karen?
Sorry, I was going to comment on that. You know, when my daughter, having been raised in Asia, came to the U.S. for school, it was middle school. I remembered her calling me and saying, "Mom, I can't believe it." She said, "Most of the people here, most of the students think that Africa is a country." I was highly embarrassed to tell her that until I was until I was older, I thought the same. Okay, so I honestly believe, and when I started to take an upper level poli-sci class at university, we were told on the first day of class that we would be given, it was on Russian history or Russian political science, and we were told by the professor that we would be given map test. We would have to study the map because it was so critical to understanding Russian history and politics. And half the students, I evidently started bailing out. And the only reason I didn't bail out was because one of the younger students convinced me to stay. And he said, "No, Karen, stay, you like it, it's worth it." So I did. And the professor never did give us any map test.
Just a threat, huh?
So it was merely a threat. But it is very important, and I'm sitting here with a map in my hand because I think it's something that Americans, we really need to focus on.
I think it's a very clever question on part of the Pew researchers, I think. But I think that the most disturbing part of what it shows is not just the general unawareness that exists in the American electorate at large about the map of the world, but that the effectiveness of American media, of American government's public relations, of propaganda, to put no finer point on it, is so great. That is, these people who have trouble finding Ukraine on the map still know what we should do about Ukraine, that is, threaten Russia, because obviously bad things are happening there, that's Russia's fault. Now, people aren't fools. People don't come to an opinion like that without some effort. And the effort is the American media system that produces this reaction amongst those who can be counted on not to have a critical attitude over against it. So I think it is a particularly disturbing and not just amusing fact about our media environment. You're watching Aware on the Air. Other comments on Ron's commentary?
Yes.
Folks?
Yeah,
go ahead,
actually
Karen.
on Hegel's meeting in Japan, I was going to discuss that, but I'm actually glad you addressed it, because that way I can just sort of make a few comments on it. One of the reactions of China to some of Hegel's remarks.
We're not talking about the German philosopher here, we're talking about the defense secretary,
yes,
right?
Sorry, yes,
okay,
our defense secretary, Chuck Hagel, yes. And I mean, basically, his comments were provocative. I mean, there was no question, the things that he was saying, provocative as well as being hypocritical. And I find it interesting. Asahi Shimbun published on April 6, Menderos. Now, Menderos is the, let's see, let me give his exact title. He's the Senior Director for Asian Affairs of Obama's National Security Council, okay? And they portrayed all the tensions in the region as the product of aggressive military, diplomatic, and economic actions by China, okay? Menderos heaped praise on Prime Minister Abe, and stated that the U.S.-Japan alliance plays a critical role in the security of the Korean Peninsula, a pointed reference to Washington's pressure on South Korea to accept a greater Japanese military role in the region. I can't imagine how the Chinese must be looking at that. Medeiros condemned China over its neutral position towards the succession of the Crimea, also hypocritical. Now, I won't even continue with the things that Medeiros said. I think we can imagine. But what I think is important is that the People's Daily, which closely, that's the China People's Daily, which closely reflects the line of the top leadership, commented on April 7th that messages sent in the last few days seemed confusing and could not be easily interpreted as friendship. I just love the Chinese way of diplomacy. And basically, China and America have they went on with an appeal that China and America have a shared interest in a stable environment to facilitate economic prosperity. Neither of them, nor the global economy, can afford confrontation or conflict. This is coming from China's leadership. Now, as an overture towards U.S. demands for military transparency, Hagel yesterday made the first ever inspection by a foreign defense official of China's only aircraft carrier. That's a ship that was originally purchased from the Ukraine. Now, I don't have any details as how he went about doing that, where he, I don't quite understand that. But I just want to point out the fact that it's China's only aircraft carrier purchased from the Ukraine.
Yes.
Now, in the more virulent Chinese nationalist press, okay, U.S. foreign policy toward Beijing has been bitterly condemned. The Global Times declared today that the U.S., and I quote, overestimates the value of rebalancing to Asia strategy if it misperceives China as easily cowed into submission. China is not Russia. If Washington continues to indulge Tokyo and Manila in provoking China, it will pay the price sooner or later. I leave it at that.
Thank you, Karen. Comments?
Yeah. We're tough too. We're going to stand up to those Americans.
Well,
on it goes.
Well, you know, you've got the government line, which is always diplomacy. Well, not always, but sometimes. And then you have some of the people. And I think the people are highly offended at the U.S. prodding South Korea or prodding Japan. I mean, how do the South Koreans feel about this?
Yeah.
Having been occupied by Japan. I know how the Chinese feel about Japan right now and what's taking place. So it's a very dangerous situation.
Our focus here at Aware on the Air, of course, is American policy. Our general notion is that what the American government is actually doing in its war policy around the world, its global assassination campaign and so forth, it's not being very candid about, to put it mildly, with the rest of the world or with Americans. Now, the rest of the world, as the victims of American war policy, know pretty well what the U.S. is doing. Americans, for the most part, don't. I mean, just talking about an example of that. So our focus is to try to see what the U.S. is doing, how it makes sense. The notion that Washington is just crazy and doing stupid things doesn't work. These people aren't stupid. They're vicious, I'm afraid. That's different. We'll, for some discussion of American politics and American policy, we'll go to Deb Johnson on independence and partisanship.
Okay, this is a great article I found, Portside, called The Debate, Independence or Partisanship. And I'm just going to read it. It's going to take me a few minutes, but I think it's well worth for the listeners, if there's anybody out there listening. There is much needed debate about the relationship that people who are working for progressive change should have with the Democratic Party. This is a debate that has existed at the edges in email discussions and private conversations, but is now moving to center stage. The current debate began with an article in Harper's Nothing Left by Adolph Reed criticizing how the Democratic Party has limited the agenda of the left. It was followed by articles by historian Mike Konskal writing in the New Republic and Harold Meyerson writing in the Democratic Party-leaning American Prospect, who took the view that the left needs to work within the Democratic Party. Richard Eskow of Campaign for America's Future, also a Democratic Party-leaning group, published two articles. The first said this debate was long overdue and concluded the left must not limit itself to the Democratic Party agenda. The second seemed to put aside differences on partisanship and urged us to get to the work of building a movement. In this article, he also provided excellent responses to Konskal and Meyerson. With Senator Bernie Sanders considering a presidential run and asking people to share their thoughts on whether he should run as an independent or a Democrat, the debate over partisanship is going to grow. We view this as an important opportunity to help many Americans realize that we need to escape from the two-party trap, as we try to do through our daily movement news and resource website, popularresistance.org. Popular resistance sees its job as not adapting to political limitations, but building a movement that puts our issues on the political agenda. We must build a mass movement that is independent of the two parties, especially the Democratic Party, because their agenda is too corrupted by the rule of money. We recognize that what is considered to be politically acceptable does not challenge the current system and therefore fails to actually solve the problems that we face. We adopt the view of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who did not ally with either party. King said, "I feel someone must remain in the position of non-alignment so that we can look objectively at both parties and be the conscience of both, not the servant or master of either." Just as King faced two parties dominated by segregationists when he was fighting Jim Crow segregation, we face two parties dominated by mega corporate power when we are fighting the domination of government by big business interests. Just as King made the immorality of racism unacceptable, we must take a moral stand against putting the interests of money before the necessities of the people. the obscenity of tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations, which has occurred at every level of government while cutting necessary public services, is not just misplaced priorities. These are immoral decisions. A child going hungry while the already wealthy hoard more wealth is one of the many immoral outcomes of these decisions. We need to explain these choices and be the conscience of a political system that is off track and off elected officials who put increasing the wealth of their campaign donors ahead of the necessities of their constituents. The role of money has become so deep in U.S. government that the menu at the political table is very limited. The real solutions to the multiple economic and environmental crises we face are supported by the majority of the public, but are not allowed in the political discussion. It is not our job as activists to limit ourselves to the choices allowed by this corrupt system, but to expand the choices. Occupy's greatest impact was to put issues on the political agenda that were not on it. Where is our power in the electoral system? Our democracy has developed into a rigged electoral system, a managed democracy. People who want real change will not get it by selecting between two pre-approved candidates who are both supported by the money of transnational corporations, Wall Street, banks, and other big business interests. The most important aspects of political participation are outside of this managed democracy, and this does not mean we cannot impact the electoral system and use it to build a mass movement. The mistakes made after the 2000 election was the knee-jerk reaction of the liberal
Intelligentsia.
Thank you.
There we go.
Which is aligned, I couldn't get it out, which is aligned with the Democratic Party to blame Ralph Nader for Al Gore's loss to George W. Bush. They do not want to look in the mirror and see the faults of their party under the Clinton-Gore leadership that moved it further into the grasp of Wall Street, the insurance industry, and other big business interests. Gore lost primarily because he was a terrible candidate who could not win his home state, or Clinton's, and who put forward a corporate agenda rather than a populist, progressive agenda. He was the classic Republican light that turned off voters who wanted someone who took their concerns seriously. If there had been an honest appraisal, more on the left would have realized that we need to embrace an alternative to the Democratic Party and should not fear undermining corporate Democrats. U.S. history has demonstrated that people can influence the direction of the country by standing for what they believe in, whether or not you win the election. Third parties have changed the political direction of the country even without winning elections by putting new issues on the political agenda. This history is missed in the debate on electoral strategy. There is power in putting forward new issues that gain electoral support and thereby force issues onto the agenda. The history is long. We can go back to the most divisive issues in U.S. history, slavery, to see the impact non-winning candidates played in changing the political discourse. From the nation's founding, the issue of abolition was off the political agenda in Congress, and slavery became the most valuable business in the nation. Neither party would discuss abolition until the westward expansion began, and then the debate was about expanding slavery, not ending it. There have been an abolition movement from before the Revolution. Indeed, Vermont abolished slavery in its constitution in 1777. Frustrated by abolition being off the agenda, abolitionists began running for office in the Liberal Party in 1840. Former President Martin Van Buren ran against slavery in 1848 under the Free Soil Party. While receiving no electoral college votes, he won enough votes in New York for the election to go to slave-holding Whig Zachary Taylor. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 pushed many Whigs and some Democrats into the Free Soil Party. The abolitionists were called spoilers, but they did not back away. They continued to run, show electoral support, and grow. By 1854, the Free Soilers, former Whigs and anti-slavery activists, formed the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican presidential candidate winning a four-way race with 39.7% of the vote. It was a refusal to back down on the issue of slavery that led to their ultimate success. The history of third parties since then has impacted a wide array of issues, including the 8-hour workday, ending child labor, collective bargaining, women's voting rights, and New Deal policies. All these were rooted in campaigns that never won the presidency, but third parties put them on the agenda, showed political support, and forced one of the two major parties to adopt the views. This has consistently been the way progressives have put issues that were off the political agenda onto the agenda through electoral politics. The lesson for the two parties is that when a movement shows electoral support in third-party campaigns, they have two choices. First, they can follow the path of the Whigs and resist the movement and become extinct. Second, they can adopt the issues of the movement by advocating for them and grow. Either path serves the movement's goal of creating transformative change. These parties do not act only in electoral sphere, but were tied to mass movements. Today we see the development of a mass movement for social, economic, and environmental justice that is rooted in the unfair economy created by big finance capitalism and the corrupt government ruled by money and not the people. And we are beginning to the signs of electoral efforts coming out of that movement. Some notable examples are the Socialist So Want campaign for the City Council in Seattle, labor activists breaking from the Democratic Party in Ohio, and at least rhetorically, the Democratic mayoral campaigns in New York and Boston. These local campaigns show the beginnings of an electoral impact from the movement for economic, social, and environmental justice. Senator Bernie Sanders is wrestling with whether he should run for president, and if so, whether he should do so in the Democratic Party or independently of it. The socialist-turned-independent candidate is facing a challenging decision in our rigged electoral system. In truth, both insurgent Democrats and third-party candidates have a very hard electoral path in this managed democracy. On balance, we come out in favor of running independently of the two parties. Sanders is right to recognize that a major purpose of his campaign is to help build a mass movement. That movement is already growing. So Sanders should realize he is joining an effort at movement building, not starting the effort. And people in the movement and growing percentages of Americans are turned off by the two major parties, with a record 46% defining themselves as independents. This number has grown by almost 10% in 1 year. The strength of any candidates begins with their credibility. Are they who they say they are? Sanders' political career began in 1971 when he ran and lost several campaigns for Senate and governor with the Liberty Union Party, which opposed the Vietnam War. He won the mayor of Burlington, Vermont as a socialist in 1981, 4 times, the final time defeating a candidate endorsed by both the Democrats and the Republicans. He won a seat in Congress in 1988 as an independent, where, among other things, he co-founded the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Sanders won his current seat in the U.S. Senate in 2005. For 43 years, Sanders has sought electoral office as a non-Democrat. For him to suddenly shift to the Democratic Party would raise questions about his integrity as a candidate. Rather than someone with principles who criticizes the corruption of the Democratic Party, many will see him as a political opportunist who will change his political stripes to run for office. While he can try to explain this away out of political necessity, the question will linger, can he be trusted? Would this self-sacrifice of his integrity be worth it? The chances of winning a Democrat primary are almost nil. The system is stacked against him, as they are for any insurgent who challenges the foundation of the Democrats' funding in Wall Street and big business. How does running as a Democrat play out? First, as we have seen in other primaries, candidates will be asked in debates, will you support whoever is the Democratic nominee? This is a deadly question for a critic of the Democratic Party. If Sanders says yes, he will have lost all of his integrity in the eyes of the voters. The likely nominee at this stage is Hillary Clinton, who since leaving the State Department has made more than $1 million in speeches to Wall Street and investor interests at a price of $200,000 a minimum per speech. She has tacked to the militarist right of Barack Obama on Iran, Russia, Syria, and Israel. Sanders will be endorsing someone who can fairly be described as a Wall Street militarist. His role in the election will be to run in the primaries, keep progressive, independents, and radicals in the party for his campaign, and then endorse a Wall Street Democrat. He will undermine the building of a movement by pulling people into the Democratic Party. If he answers that he will not necessarily support the Democratic nominee, then he risks being excluded from debates. This has happened before, and with Sanders' more than 40-year history of not being a Democrat, partisans have more than enough ammunition to keep him out of the debates. If this is a path this is taken, Sanders' voice will be muted. Finally, running as a Democrat means his voice will only be heard in the primaries, not in the general election. Most Americans who are closely tied to either party do not pay attention to the primary season, but only get involved in elections when the nominations are complete. His message will be heard by partisans, not by the broader public. The two big barriers to this third-party runs are ballot access and inclusion in the debates. Ballot access takes up most of the time, money, and volunteer energy of the third-party candidates. To be successful at this, Sanders should run as an independent who seeks to work with multiple existing third parties and create parties or ballot lines in states where there is not an existing third party. He should make this strategy clear at the outset and note the positive value of uniting opposition to the Democrats and Republicans. The Green Party, with an agenda consistent with Sanders, will be on the ballot in half the states by 2016, including some big challenges like California, Texas, New York, and Florida. There are also state-level progressive parties whose nominations Sanders should also seek, as well as smaller national parties such as the Justice Party or the various socialist parties. If he is nominated by a coalition of parties, Sanders would only have to get on the ballot in 20 or so more states. Sanders could make a show of unity against the two parties by holding a unity convention, perhaps on Labor Day, to show support for working people. Presidential debates are another challenge. Sanders has an advantage in that he is starting as a U.S. Senator with some national name recognition. Since polls are in large part about name recognition, he should immediately do better in polls than most third-party candidates. If he can unite multiple parties, that will add to his support, media attention, and name recognition. With all this, he will have the credibility to raise tens of millions of dollars, which will ensure he is taken seriously. In recent elections, there has been a growing awareness of the unfairness of the private corporation that sponsors presidential debates. This corporation, co-chaired by former leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties and funded by big business interests, has worked hard to keep third-party candidates out. The combination of Sanders' credibility and the movement challenging the Commission on presidential debates makes it possible to overcome this challenge as well. This is a unique opportunity to build an independent mass movement. Many progressive Democrats have learned that the best their party can produce, Barack Obama, is unsatisfactory. Whether on militarism, Wall Street, the environment, or other issues that are being faced, Obama has sided with big business interests rather than the people. Americans have seen the bipartisans in Congress ally against their interests and in support of big business or the security state repeatedly in recent years. In addition to record numbers of Americans defining themselves as independents, a record number of Americans want a third party according to a 2013 poll. 60% say the Democrats and Republican parties do such a poor job of representing American people that a third major party is needed. Indeed, a new low of 26% believe the two major parties inadequately represent Americans. And a 2012 poll found that 68% of voters said they would definitely vote for or consider voting for a third-party candidate. These are polls unlike we have ever seen. At the same time, people's movements are growing, creating a new national consensus. The Occupy encampments were a popular revolt against the system, challenging Wall Street domination of the economy and political system and calling for a systematic change. Since the encampment phase has ended, the movement has actually grown with mass protests against poverty, wages, extreme energy extraction, tuition and debt of college students, and the wealth divide, among other issues. This is a moment to put these issues on the agenda, and the electoral process should be used as a part of that effort.
Thank you very much, Deb.
And I apologize for the length of it.
Well, it's on to a very important topic.
Yes.
What do you all think? Has Deb outlined a way forward for the anti-war movement?
Question, what was the name of that article and who was the author?
It's The Debate, Independence or Partisanship, Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, Nation of Change, Portside.
Stuart, you have a comment on this?
Maybe one on nonpartisanship. I had recently seen a comment from an immigration rights activist who said something that seems relevant to this. He said, "My take is that the recent success that we're seeing from the migrants' rights movement has come from the grassroots. All the mainstream organizations that used to counsel activists that going after Obama and the Democrats as aggressively as going after the Republicans was foolish and non-strategic, all those have been proven wrong. Aggressive rhetoric against the administration's deportation record has led to concrete moves from Obama to re-examine deportation policies. This confirms his belief, Ellie Wayne's belief, that true power, rooted in truth, comes paradoxically from the marginalized, not from the established." So,
Since it looks like the American political system will present us with a choice between a Bush and a Clinton for president in 2016, it seems to me that things like this at least should be talked about, should be thought about, right?
I definitely agree. And that's why I thought it was very important.
Well,
No, well, you need to find candidates who are willing to lose and keep losing into the foreseeable future, and a lot of them are not willing to do that.
And now Zeese and Flowers here especially tap Bernie Sanders as an example of someone who actually has won some elections as a possibility for this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, you skipped over the fact that Al Gore had a 500,000 more votes in the popular vote than George Bush did in 2000.
Yeah,
So,
I sure did.
yeah, so.
I have one comment where, by saying that if Bernie Sanders runs on the Democratic ticket, that he will be questioned seriously his commitment. We had David Green here who ran on the Democratic ticket precisely because it was so difficult to run on any alternative ticket, and he wanted to be heard in the primaries. And I'm hoping he will run again for election. He is looking at, you know, what can be done in the future because, as I think you just said, Ron, we need candidates who are willing to run and lose in order to be heard.
That's right.
And eventually to consolidate. Now, I did comment on the piece list that we had here not long ago, and I saw that somebody was setting up a new party somewhere. My impression was that it was in a rural area of Illinois, but I could be wrong on that. And my question, and they said it would run parallel with the Green Party. So my question was, well, why? Why not then align the two? Because what I see happening in the United States, partly because we are a huge society, we're a huge nation, it is what I call factionalism. There is so much factionalism that we can never really accomplish anything in this area, and you can only really accomplish when you unite. And that's why, even though Occupy didn't last, to me it was good because it showed that people were coming together with their various concerns and uniting on a common theme or for a common goal. So, and I'm hoping that leaders and different groups and movements have come out of that movement.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I would suggest that the proliferation of parties is damaging to all of them. The more of them there are,
Yeah.
the less seriously any one of them will be taken.
then
We
there
wouldn't
should be
take them as
just one.
seriously as we take the Republicans and Democrats today, you mean?
well,
Well, I
Who's
don't
waiting?
know. I mean, I kind of look at
Exactly.
the whole thing like it's, you know, we're looking at what the Democrats are doing, and, you know.
well, I would like to see more support for the Green Party. I
Yeah,
think that they have
me
been there.
too.
They're known. Many of us have supported them in the past.
We don't have any of that old
And
baggage.
I think that if, as time goes by and people become more disaffected with the Democratic Party, now Bernie Sanders running on the Green Party, a problem there arises because, Carl, I recall you mentioning something about Bernie Sanders and his policy.
Yeah,
This goes back
right.
maybe a couple
Greens
months
aren't
ago.
really happy with him in
that
Vermont.
Maybe about the
regarding
F-35 program?
his environmental
Oh,
policies. I don't know. I have no idea. I just remember
Okay.
Carl making a comment about Bernie, because I'd always liked Bernie, but as soon as I
That was,
heard that,
that was a dispute from years ago, and
Oh.
we had to do with toxic waste from Vermont
Okay.
and what Sanders was doing when he was a Vermont politician.
Well, I think he supports self-sustaining communities, which I think is just a wonderful thing.
well, I definitely think that the environment is a #1 concern, and any any election, I think that if that isn't a major point, that
Let me try this on you all and see if what sort of reaction you might have. If we look at American history and the history of parties in the United States, as Zeese and Flowers do in this article, it's actually instructive because it challenges our notion that parties are always essentially the same. I mean, you don't have to go back very far in American history to find parties sort of changing positions on issues, whether it's race in the South or economic progressivism at 1932 or even the question of slavery, which I'm not entirely happy with the sketch that was given in this article, but that's an argument for another day. My point is that parties often change their shape, both publicly and in fact, and those are not necessarily always the same. What a party says publicly and what it actually does in office, as we know, turns out to be quite different. Okay, we're looking right now at a Democratic Party that elected a president with the help of the anti-war movement. There's no way in which you can account for Obama's rise without talking about the opposition to the Bush wars in the Middle East. The anti-war movement came out for Barack Obama. Barack Obama immediately betrayed them in office, expanding the wars in the Middle East when many Americans who voted for him thought he would reduce them. But the question then becomes what happens to these sentiments after they've been seduced and abandoned by the parties, as has happened throughout the history of American politics. Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 ran on a platform of a balanced budget. He said the Depression had occurred because the Republicans had been spendthrifts. They had spent too much money, and that if he were elected president, he would balance the budget, and the depression would end. In other words, the sort of thing we hear from Paul Ryan these days. Now, the question then becomes, how do we understand what the effects of our votes are going to be? Right now in America, we have the peculiar possibility of a reorientation, a realignment taking place in the Republican Party. Remember, the Republican Party in the last election produced a candidate who was the right of Mr. Obama on the questions of war and the economy, when he didn't agree with him entirely. I mean, they were awfully close. But in order to do that, the Republicans had to suppress a wing of the Republican Party that was anti-war and anti-Wall Street. Ron Paul had a rally on campus at the University of Illinois in which he turned out the largest anti-war demonstration that's been seen in Champaign-Urbana since the invasion of Iraq. Now, when the Republicans have this problem, they have the Paul problem, the libertarian problem. They try to minimize it in various ways. They try to suppress it, and they were able to do it in the Republican convention that nominated Romney. But the fact of the matter is, there still is an element of the Republican Party that is anti-war and anti-Wall Street, and it's associated with the Paul family, Ron and Rand Paul, although Rand Paul himself tries to obfuscate it pretty successfully. What would happen if an anti-war Republican Party should emerge? And should that be what we press for rather than for a third party, as Zeese and Flowers suggest?
It's never going to happen.
Well, it's exactly that assumption.
Thank you, Karen.
But it's never going to happen was what would have said if you had told a Democrat in 1932, suppose we had a semi-socialist Democratic Party in 1932. And people would nod their heads and say that's never going to happen. They got a rich man as their nominee, and that certainly won't happen. They will run a more right-wing. Herbert Hoover, who is a well-known liberal in our current discussion, and an internationalist, was known as substantially to the left of the Democratic nominee, Franklin Roosevelt.
But we make too much profit from those weapons that I don't see that happening.
Well, but what we're talking about now is electoral strategies. This is the point that Deb has introduced.
Well,
and I'm suggesting that they may be more fluid. And in fact, the article that she presented suggests how they might be more fluid than we expect. I think there may be other things here. The anti-war wing of the Democratic Party has been destroyed, right? it was seduced and abandoned, as I said, by Barack Obama.
I mean, a
the
person's
anti-war
vote-
wing of the Republican Party still exists.
A person's vote is somewhat sacred, and even though now we have to apply our vote on a machine, which I'm totally against, I still think we should go back to paper ballots, but that's
Yeah.
besides the
Can I
point.
say something?
You know, your vote is sacred. You have a chance to have a vote, and I think to vote for a party that is criminal, it just doesn't sit well with me at
Which
all.
party are you
Are
talking
there
about?
any that
I'm
are?
talking.
I agree
That's a
with you,
real
but I
problem.
think we
It
may.
is.
Yeah,
I mean,
because it's personal. I don't. You know, I don't agree with what the Democratic Party is doing, and I don't agree with what the Republican Party is doing. So where does that leave me?
with Zeese and Flowers, probably.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing
Sorry.
it does for us. I'm sorry. Yes, you'd spoken first, Karen. Go
No,
ahead.
I had something to talk about related to Turkey and Seymour Hersh, and I think it's important to get that out right now, is that Seymour Hersh has published an article related to the fact that Turkey was probably behind the weapons, the chemical weapons killings in Syria, arming al-Nusra. And the White House knew this at the time we were looking at bombing. and I've got all the information here, but I don't want to go into too much detail, and now there's not enough time. But I think it's something that's very important to know, because Seymour Hersh was not allowed to publish this anywhere in the U.S. He had to go to the London newspapers to have it heard. So not many people are aware of it. It was published on the London Review. So I just think that needs to be stated, and it needs to be stated now, so anyone who wants to look it up can look it up.
But
London Review of Books, that's it, yeah.
It's instructive, if for no other reasons than to see the actual arguments that are taking place in American politics about Benghazi, about Obama's failure to stand up to Putin, or his failure to bomb Syria, and so on, that all of these are cloud cuckoo land. This is fantasy. It has nothing to do with the policy the U.S. is actually following abroad, with the cynical war policy that this administration is pursuing, or with how to counter it. And so, you know, where do we begin? What do we do?
But those cuckoos do depend on deliberate disinformation. David Swanson had a nice comment. I don't need to be convinced that the U.S. should stay out of Russia, the Ukraine. I need handles with which to help keep the U.S. out. Whatever develops, most of our neighbors will have had no idea that the emergency of Benghazi was a lie, no idea that Assad didn't use chemical weapons, no idea what's being done with drones, and a powerful certainty, not even questioned, that Russia had or has huge numbers of troops on the border threatening war, which is something that's been
Right.
put out recently without support.
Right.
And it is very likely absolutely as baseless as the similar allegation that the U.S. made before the beginning of the first Gulf War, that that Iraq had troops massing on the borders of Kuwait, of Saudi Arabia, I mean.
But we need a lot of sorting out here, I think, Stuart. The emergency in Benghazi wasn't a lie. It turns out that what the Republicans were saying about Benghazi, that the U.S. was using it to ship weapons from Libya to Turkey, and Turkey was using them to try to provoke war with Syria, and including an American involvement. This is all in Hersh's article. This is what Hersh is arguing.
That's an important point, but that's not what I hear the Republicans saying. The Republicans are saying that they did a lousy job of protecting their own. And what they should be saying is what Hersh is saying,
which
is a
may or
completely
may
different
not
thing.
be true, but is a
Yeah.
bagatelle in comparison with what the U.S. was actually doing with Benghazi.
Right, and that's important.
And the only person who raised
But that's
that
not what you
question-
hear about when. So that's what Swanson is saying was a lie. That that the whole issue was the U.S. was doing a lousy job of protecting itself and was insufficiently belligerent.
Remember, the Benghazi issue began, though, with Rand Paul asking in a Senate hearing, asking Mrs. Clinton if the U.S. was running guns into Turkey in order to counter the Syrian government. And Mrs. Clinton lied, obviously, by saying that she really didn't know anything about that, that he'd have to ask another agency. She meant the CIA. So, I mean, when we're dealing, this is a battle by night, right? You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 15th week of 2014. Our thanks to Jason and Yosef for direction and production, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. We also want to remind you of other programs like ours here on UPTV, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org, notably Democracy Now! Every weekday morning at 7 a.m. and The Big Picture every weekday morning at 8 a.m. Democracy Now! Is repeated in the afternoons, and that was the source, as Karen pointed out, of the discussion with Seymour Hersh that we've been talking about this evening. Members and friends of AWARE are invited to sit on this panel and participate in AWARE on the Air. We record at noon on Tuesdays in the Urbana City building. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.